what Christmas actually costs. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here with me today. Before I start, I'm curious where you're listening from. If you feel like it, drop your city in the comments. And before I get into this, go ahead and subscribe, because this is one of those conversations that tends to ruin things you were very comfortable believing, and I'd hate for you to miss the follow-up existential spiral. I'm not here to tell you how to celebrate. I'm here to ask what we're actually honoring. Stay with me until the end. This question changes meaning as we go. Merry Christmas, if you mean it. And before anyone gets dramatic, a quick disclaimer. I'm not trying to ruin Christmas. I'm not trying to destroy your faith. I'm just passing along information that ruined my illusions a few years ago, cracked a few walls, and politely escorted me out of the matrix. I took the red pill. I didn't ask for it. It just happened. So if this messes with your decorations a little, consider it character development. I don't know when you're listening to this. Maybe the gifts are still out. Maybe you're lying around after a big meal. And just so we're clear, I actually love Christmas. I love the lights. I love the decorations. I love how people suddenly remember how to be generous. I just wish we didn't need a holiday to do it. Every holiday creates this temporary version of who we think we are. Kinder, softer, more giving, and then it fades. Not because we're terrible, but because distraction is easier than consistency. So no, this isn't an attack. It's about noticing the illusion while we're still standing inside it. Now, let's talk. Every year, we all say the same thing with unearned confidence. Christmas is about Christ. Christmas is the celebration of his birth. We say it loudly, proudly, and repeatedly. Like repetition alone upgrades something into fact. And what's wild is that the Bible itself never actually says that. No date, no season. No heavenly calendar notification. Nothing. But somehow we talk about December 25th like God personally RSVP'd. And nobody ever asks why we're so sure. Because asking that question apparently ruins Christmas, which is fascinating, because curiosity is treated like a greater threat than misinformation. We didn't get this certainty from Scripture. We got it from tradition, repetition, and vibes. Say something long enough, decorate it aggressively, and eventually people will defend it like it came straight from Mount Sinai. So let's ask the question we've been trained not to ask. If Christmas is about Christ's birth, when did we decide the date? Not when do we celebrate it. Obviously, we celebrate it on December 25th. We've committed. But who decided that was the date, and based on what? Because the Bible is suspiciously quiet about something we treat like gospel fact. And when a text is silent, that usually means don't assume, not fill in the blanks with confidence. Here's where the illusion starts cracking. December 25th wasn't revealed. It wasn't discovered. It was chosen, much later. People. With reasons. Practical reasons. Cultural reasons. The date already meant something. Winter solstice. Light returning. Existing festivals people already cared about. Christianity didn't erase those meanings. It rebranded them. Same season, new storyline. Everyone calm down. And before anyone hyperventilates, this isn't shocking or evil. It's human. What's uncomfortable is not that a decision was made. It's that we pretend it wasn't. We act like this date fell straight out of heaven, fully formed, and now questioning it feels like heresy, even though Scripture never demanded that level of loyalty to a calendar. That's the part nobody likes to sit with. Christmas didn't fall from the sky. It was curated, positioned, strategically aligned with what already worked. And it worked so well that now, centuries later, even pointing that out feels like a personal attack. A choice became tradition. Tradition became doctrine. Doctrine became identity. And now honesty feels like betrayal. And that's where the cost starts showing up. Not in gifts or credit cards or family drama. That comes later. But in how aggressively we defend a story once it stops being honest. Because the moment a tradition can't survive curiosity, it's no longer about faith. It's about control. And Christmas, whether we like it or not, is one of the cleanest examples of that shift. And this is usually the moment where someone says, okay, fine, maybe the date isn't exact. Maybe the tradition's evolved, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is what Christmas means to me in my heart, which sounds very sincere and very grown up, and also collapses immediately under even casual biblical scrutiny, because Scripture is not sentimental about the heart. At all. Jeremiah 17:9 says it plainly, without a trigger warning. The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked. Who can know it? That is not metaphorical fluff. That is a diagnosis. and it's one people love to quote abstractly but hate to apply personally. We nod along when it's read, and then immediately turn around and treat our own hearts like reliable spiritual authorities. The Bible doesn't say the heart is occasionally confused or a little misguided. It says deceitful above all things, desperately wicked, which means your thoughts, your impulses, your justifications, and yes, you're deeply held. Personal meanings are not neutral territory. They are compromised. Just because you don't say every thought out loud doesn't mean it isn't there. Scripture assumes the mess exists whether you acknowledge it or not. So when someone says, it doesn't matter when it happened, it's what Christmas means in my heart, what they are unintentionally saying is, I'm grounding something holy in the most unreliable source Scripture warns me about. That's not devotion. That's confidence misplaced. You're taking a celebration you insist is sacred and anchoring it in something the Bible explicitly tells you not to trust. Proverbs 28:26 doesn't soften this either. He that trusteth in his own heart is a fool. No footnotes, no disclaimers, no modern retranslation that makes it feel nicer. And yet, we keep using the heart as the ultimate defense. Don't question it. Don't examine it. Don't complicate it. Because apparently sincerity is now the highest form of theology. Jesus, meanwhile, goes in the opposite direction entirely. In Luke 9:23, he says, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, not affirm himself, not center himself, deny himself, which is awkward because modern Christian culture has somehow turned self-focus into a spiritual virtue. We've convinced ourselves that as long as something feels meaningful, it must be aligned. Scripture never supports that logic. This is where things get uncomfortable. Because the issue isn't Christmas decorations or calendars or even dates. It's orientation. Who is at the center? Scripture repeatedly warns against cultures that revolve around the self, and it names that pattern clearly in 2 Timothy 3:1-2, when it says people become lovers of themselves. Not openly evil, not cartoon villains, just quietly self-centered, sincerely convinced, and deeply certain they mean well. And this is why the Bible never commands birthday celebrations and never portrays them positively. When birthdays appear, they're attached to rulers and ego and excess. Pharaoh's birthday ends with an execution in Genesis 40. Herod's birthday ends with John the Baptist beheaded in Matthew 14. Scripture doesn't romanticize self-celebration because it understands how quickly the self becomes sacred if no one checks it. Ecclesiastes 7:1 drives the point home without apology when it says, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Not because life is worthless, but because character matters more than origin. Who you become matters more than the fact that you showed up. Scripture is relentlessly uninterested in celebrating the self for existing. So when we insist Christmas is holy because it feels holy to us, we're not practicing faith. We're practicing sentimentality. We've taken something we claim is about God and quietly recentered it around ourselves, our feelings, our memories, our comfort, and our need for the story to stay simple. That's the real cost. Not joy, not celebration, but the slow replacement of truth with sincerity and discipline with tradition. Christmas didn't become hollow because people asked too many questions. It became hollow because we stopped asking them. And that's not an attack. That's an observation. One Scripture has been making for a very long time. And once you see that pattern, the next part gets awkward fast, because now we have to talk about what Scripture actually treats as the problem. Spoiler alert, it's not joy. It's not celebration. It's not even tradition. It's the self quietly sliding into the center and refusing to move. Scripture doesn't scream about this. It just keeps pointing at it over and over again like, that right there, that's the issue. The Bible is relentlessly unimpressed with self-focus, not in a dramatic way, in a tired, seen-this-before way. Jesus doesn't say, make sure you feel meaningful. He says, in Luke 9:23, "Is any man will come after me, let him deny himself," not express himself, not center himself, deny himself, which is inconvenient. Because modern Christianity has somehow decided that spiritual depth looks a lot like personal fulfillment with a Bible verse taped on top. This is where greed and gluttony stop being about money and food and start being about appetite. Appetite for attention, appetite for comfort, appetite for affirmation, appetite for the story always landing in a way that makes us feel good about ourselves. Scripture names this without drama in 2 Timothy 3:1-2, when it says people become lovers of themselves. Not villains, not monsters, just people deeply committed to themselves while sincerely believing they're doing something holy. And that's why this keeps circling back to the heart, because every defense eventually lands there. It's what Christmas means to me in my heart, which would be touching if Scripture hadn't already addressed that exact move and shut it down. Jeremiah 17:9 doesn't say the heart is occasionally confused. It says, the heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked. Who can know it? That's not poetic exaggeration. That's a warning label. The Bible assumes your inner world is messy, compromised, and very good at lying to you while sounding reasonable. So when we take something we insist is sacred and say it's justified by what's in our heart, we're grounding holiness in the one place Scripture tells us not to trust. Proverbs 28:26 makes this painfully direct. He that trusteth in his own heart is a fool. No nuance, no footnotes, no except during the holidays. And yet this is the exact logic we use to shut down any conversation that gets uncomfortable. Don't question it. Don't analyze it. It means something to me. End of discussion. What's happening here isn't faith. It's self-protection. We're using sincerity as a shield. And the irony is that Scripture never treats sincerity as spiritual authority. It treats it as something that needs discipline, which brings us to an even more uncomfortable observation. The Bible is deeply uninterested in celebrating the self simply for existing. Birth, in Scripture, is acknowledged, but it's not idolized. There is no command to celebrate birthdays. None. And when birthdays do show up, the Bible somehow manages to make them profoundly unfun. Pharaoh's birthday in Genesis 40 ends with an execution. Herod's birthday in Matthew 14 ends with John the Baptist losing his head. That's it. That's the full biblical birthday montage. No cake, no candles. Just unchecked ego and terrible decisions. That's not accidental. Scripture is making a point without announcing it. Self-celebration, especially when tied to power and entitlement, goes sideways fast. Which is why Ecclesiastes 7:1 says something that feels almost rude in our culture. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Not because life is meaningless, but because character matters more than origin. Who you become matters more than the fact that you arrived. So when we build entire seasons around centering ourselves, our memories, our feelings, our nostalgia, and then insist it's holy because we slapped God's name on it, Scripture just kind of stands there blinking. Not angry, not shocked, just unconvinced. Because it has never been impressed by beginnings, and it has never trusted the heart to define holiness. And this is where the tension finally snaps into focus. We're not wrong for celebrating. We're wrong for pretending Scripture endorses the way we center ourselves while doing it. Christmas didn't become spiritually hollow because people asked too many questions. It became hollow because the self slowly took the place Scripture never intended it to have, and the Bible saw that coming a long time ago. And now that we've dealt with the heart, the self, and Scripture's complete lack of interest in our personal meaning projects, there's one more thing we have to look at. Because this is where people usually get defensive instead of curious. How did December 25th actually become the date? Not spiritually, not emotionally, on paper. This is where I need to be very clear about what I am and am not saying. I am not telling you what really happened. I am not unveiling secret knowledge. I am telling you what has been written, documented, preserved, argued about by people far closer to the early church than we are. This isn't revelation. This is a paper trail. Some of the earliest Christian writings outside of Scripture don't claim Jesus was born on December 25th, because someone knew it for a fact. They suggest it through symbolic logic. One early example often cited is Hippolytus of Rome, in the early 3rd century, who proposed that Jesus was conceived on the same date he would later die. That date was placed in late March. Add 9 months and you land in late December. That's not history. That's theological math. Elegant, symbolic, meaningful to some, but still not evidence. At the same time, December already mattered culturally. Late December carried heavy symbolism in the Roman world. Winter solstice, darkness giving way to light. The rebirth of the sun, festivals already existed. The calendar wasn't empty, waiting for Christianity to show up and fill it. Meaning was already there. So as Christianity moved from persecuted movement to institutional power, a decision was made that made sense at the time. The symbolism was reassigned. Christ became the true light. The date stayed. The meaning changed. And again, this isn't sinister. it's practical. Institutions do this all the time. They don't erase what people already understand. They reframe it. The uncomfortable part is not that this happened. The uncomfortable part is how confidently we pretend it didn't. Over time, symbolic reasoning hardened into tradition. Tradition hardened into certainty. Certainty hardened into don't ask questions. And now we defend the date like it came with footnotes straight from heaven. Which brings us to the next shift, and this is where things stop being historical and start being emotional. At some point, December 25th stopped being a symbolic choice and became a loyalty test. You're no longer discussing theology or history, you're threatening identity. Because once a tradition gets old enough, people stop remembering that it was ever optional. This is how symbols become doctrine without anyone officially declaring them so. Repetition replaces reflection. The story gets told the same way every year until the telling itself becomes sacred. Questioning the date no longer feels like curiosity. It feels like disrespect. Like you're attacking Christmas itself, when all you're really doing is pointing at the scaffolding. And notice how fast the conversation shuts down. Why does it matter? You're overthinking it. Don't ruin Christmas. Those aren't theological arguments. They're emotional defenses. They exist to protect the feeling, not the truth. Once something becomes emotionally necessary, it becomes immune to examination. This is the moment where certainty becomes a substitute for faith. Not because people are stupid or malicious, but because certainty is comfortable. It doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't require wrestling. It doesn't require humility. You just repeat the story, sing the songs, feel the feelings, and move on. And the longer that cycle runs, the harder it becomes to admit that parts of it were constructed, not commanded. So by the time we get here, December 25th isn't just a date. It's an identity marker. It's tradition. It's memory. It's nostalgia. It's untouchable. And anyone who questions it gets accused of taking something away, when really, they're just asking where it came from. And that's the real shift. We didn't move from scripture to tradition overnight. We moved from curiosity to certainty, so slowly that nobody noticed when the questions stopped being welcome. And once questions are no longer allowed, truth becomes optional. That's not about Christmas. That's about power, comfort, and control. And that's the point where the cost stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal. And this is the part where the conversation usually gets messy. Because once you realize December 25th was a choice, the next obvious question is the one nobody wants to answer. If God already established holy days, why aren't those the ones we fight over? Scripture is not vague about sacred time. God doesn't leave it up to vibes. He names days. He sets rhythms. Sabbath, appointed feasts, times of gathering and remembrance. These aren't suggestions. They're structured interruptions meant to pull people out of constant production and consumption. And they're not centered on the self. They're centered on God's action in history. What's interesting is that when Scripture talks about seasons, it doesn't give us 4 Hallmark-friendly quadrants. It works in 2 movements, spring and fall, planting and harvest, beginning and fulfillment. Passover in the spring, tabernacles in the fall, arrival and dwelling. And when people actually pay attention to the biblical details around Jesus' birth, the travel, the crowding, the lack of space, the shepherds in the fields, what starts to emerge isn't winter magic. It's festival logistics. There was no room at the inn because the town was full. Not randomly full. Festival full. Feast full. Which makes far more sense if people were gathering for an appointed time like the Feast of Tabernacles. When families traveled, temporary shelters were everywhere. And the entire point was that God dwells with his people. John 1:14 doesn't even try to be subtle about this. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word dwelt literally means tabernacled, as in lived among, as in the feast about God dwelling with humanity. That's the part that should stop people cold. Scripture already gave us a framework for understanding arrival, not a birthday, an appearing, a dwelling, an appointed time. And instead of wrestling with that, we stopped honoring the days God actually named and created a new one that was easier to sentimentalize, easier to market, and far easier to center around ourselves. God even says, regarding the end of things, pray it doesn't happen on the Sabbath. Not because dates are random, but because rhythms matter. Sacred time matters. And yet here we are, arguing endlessly over a birthday Scripture never mentions, while ignoring the calendar God actually laid out. This isn't about proving an exact date. It's about noticing replacement. We didn't just forget God's holy days. We substituted them. And then we defended the substitute like it was untouchable. So now we can finally name the cost, and it's not rhythm or discipline or even tradition. What Christmas actually costs is our ability to trust reality without fear. It costs our perception. It costs our relationship with creation. And it costs our willingness to believe that God meant what he said in the beginning. Because the first gaslighting didn't start with dates or holidays. It started when we were taught to be suspicious of the world God created. Trees became questionable. Shapes became dangerous. Directions became symbolic threats. Seasons became suspect. We were trained to look at creation and ask, is this pagan? Instead of asking, why did God make it this way? Fear replaced curiosity, and we were told that fear was discernment. Scripture doesn't start that way. It starts with, in the beginning, God created, not in the beginning, beware. Light and dark both appear in the same opening act. God separates them, yes, but he creates both. He doesn't panic about contrast. He uses it. And somewhere along the way, we decided that anything containing contrast must be evil unless we sanitize it first. That's where the second gaslighting takes over. Knowledge that isn't institutional becomes dangerous. Healers become witches. Nature-based understanding becomes pagan. Observation becomes astrology. Paying attention to cycles becomes rebellion. Not because scripture says so, but because control prefers permission. And suddenly, mud on a blind man's eyes is a miracle when Jesus does it, but leaves on a wound are demonic when someone else does. Same world, same materials. Different authority stamp. Then comes the cruelest churn. After we're told to distrust creation, we're told to distrust ourselves. Scripture says the heart is deceitful, compromised, unreliable. Fair enough. But then we're told in the same breath that something is holy because it means something to us in our heart. Which one is it? Either the heart needs discernment, or it doesn't. You don't get to undermine a person's inner trust and then use that same inner trust to shut down questions. That contradiction forces people to override their own noticing. They feel something is off, but they're told that noticing is the problem. That discomfort isn't wisdom. That questioning isn't faith. That curiosity is dangerous. And when someone learns to doubt their own perception long enough, they'll accept almost anything as holy if it's labeled correctly. And this is where replacement becomes normalized. God already gave a calendar, Sabbaths, feasts, appointed times, rhythms anchored in remembrance, restraint, and presence. They weren't sentimental. They weren't consumer-friendly. They didn't center the self, so we stopped honoring them. Then created new celebrations that were easier to manage, easier to market, easier to feel good about. And once those replacements stuck, we defended them harder than the originals. That's the gaslighting. We forgot what God named, substituted what we preferred, and then accused anyone who noticed of attacking faith. We separated what God created together, feared what he called good, distrusted what he used, and then congratulated ourselves for being holy. So no, the cost of Christmas isn't joy or celebration. The cost is fragmentation. The cost is fear where there shouldn't be any. The cost is calling suspicion righteousness and calling obedience rebellion. The cost is teaching people to mistrust creation, mistrust themselves, and mistrust curiosity, all while insisting we're honoring God. And if this feels uncomfortable, good, it should. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because something doesn't line up. Scripture has never been afraid of light and dark existing in the same sentence. We are. And Christmas didn't cause that fear. It just exposed how practiced we've become at living with it. That's the cost. So Merry Christmas, or at least, may it be honest.